So what can we learn about our Morris Minor by taking a close look at its engine and the various plates in the engine compartment? Well, there's two things. It's sort of like archaeologists. We can discover a little bit about its history, but we can also dig in and we can discover what some of the original finishes might have been on the car to help us with the restoration. So when you're taking the car apart and you're doing the restoration, you really want to be careful and look for clues. And so we're going to go through this engine compartment to show some of the clues that would suggest this is a very late model Traveler, again from post 69, 70, 71. And there's a whole bunch of things that all come together on that. But let's start with the most obvious, the first thing we would look at when we're changing title, which is the chassis number or the build plate. Now, here it is on the bulkhead of the car. Originally, it probably was a bit fancier. It probably looked like that, and the stamping would have been in the silver area here. Obviously, the paint's gone on there, and this is all we have. Now, what does this all mean? We see MAW5D, a series of numbers, which are over 1,290,000, and then a little tiny F at the end, okay? The M stands for Morris. The A means it has an engine which is less than 1,200 cc's, which indeed it does. The W means that it has a Traveler body, which it does. The 5 in there means that it is the 1098 engine. And the D means it's a deluxe model. Now, you know, it has a heater and it has these bumper overriders. So that all makes sense with what we know about the car. And the high number, remember there was just a bit over 1,600,000 of these built, means it's a late model. What does that little tiny F at the end tell us? Well, that's really important. That tells us that the car was built in Adderley Park near Birmingham, not at Cowley near Oxford. And they shifted the production of commercial vehicles and the Travelers in 1969 to near Birmingham, Adderley Park. Now, here's the sad thing about that. The build records were destroyed. And so if you have an Adderley Park built Traveler or Morris of any sort, you're likely not going to be able to get any build records for the car. Unfortunately, they were lost. Ones which were built at Cowley or Abingdon near Oxford, you can get those build records. So we have to be especially careful now because we're not going to get any records for the car. Now, the color of the car, teal blue, with a lime flower, sort of a greeny interior, that would be a color combination that you could get in 1970-71. So that sort of goes along with what the chassis plate tells us about the age of the car. There are some other numbers on the car you want to look at. Somewhere on the bulkhead, you might have a body number. You also would have a body number down here in the bottom part, at the bottom of the engine bay. You can see it right there. So there's a couple places you can get the chassis numbers, or the body numbers. They won't match the chassis number, okay? And by the way, the chassis numbers were done sequentially. But if you have a high chassis number on the car, a build number, you would expect then to have a high body number. And you can check that out there. Some of the cars, they apparently stamped a number in the floorboards by the driver's side. Most of the time you can't find that number anymore. Now, the other number that you might want to look at is the engine plate. Now, a lot of rebuilt engines, this will be missing. It's an aluminum plate, and it will be missing in there. And what does this all mean? It says 10MA-U.H, and then there's the engine number. And you can see it's a pretty high engine number there, and which would be what we would expect. The 10MA-UH, the main thing is it tells us that that's, you know, an engine you would have had in a minor like this, and the H stands for high compression. So that kind of goes along with everything. Now, the history of the car, why it suggests it's pretty original, was it has a J registration, a British registration plate. So the suffix on the plate is J. That would mean registration in late 1970, 1971 most likely, which goes along with what we're seeing on the build plates. The history of the car was told to me by the son of the owner. The owner bought the car in the very early 1980s, used it to tour around Europe, and then had it exported from the UK to Southern California in 1983. So it's been here a long time, and which is, of course, why it survived so well, not completely rusted out. By the way, what's an interesting aside is that the owner was a Blackfoot Indian, and the family is from southern Alberta, which is my old home. And so we're keeping the car in the Alberta family here, even though it's down in Southern California now. Okay, so what are a few other things that we could look at that would tell us, okay, yeah, immediately, this is probably a very late 60s, 69 to 71 Morris Minor. Well, there's a few things that give it away. One, of course, is this so-called elephant trunk. Has a heater, and this brings air in. It's made out of plastic, which is much better than, for instance, the MGA ones, which are made out of a kind of a fiberboard and fall apart. These are really durable. So that you would see on a late model Morris. If we take a look down at the oil filter, we see that it has a canister style, or a disposable oil filter, rather than the old-fashioned canister style that had a paper or a cloth filter element inside, and you would unscrew from the bottom and get oil all over everything. This has a much more modern type of a disposable, single-use oil filter here, which you can buy replacements for. That was put on the very, very late models. This would not be a retrofit, which it's very popular to retrofit them, but that was put only on the very latest model of the Morris Minors. Another thing that we would see is to see the plastic tube for the vacuum advance. Earlier engines would have a metal tube that came around to the front. There'd be a little structure here, and then it would go around there. You see them in MGAs, for example, things like that. The very late model Morris Minors would have had the simple plastic vacuum tube. Going further along here, the crankcase ventilation. If we look at the valve cover here, it's different than on an earlier model Morris Minor, which would have had crankcase ventilation coming up here and then a tube coming into the air cleaner. Instead, we have crankcase ventilation here, much more updated, little filter body, and then the tube going in that way. Again, you will see that on North American cars in particular, and obviously some UK cars like this one is, very, very late in the run of the Morris Minor. But that would have been something that would be on very, very late run cars. The other thing that helps us figure out the age here is the way that the fuel line comes out of the SU fuel pump there into the carburetor float bowl. You notice that it's attached with Jubilee clips. It doesn't have a banjo fitting here like the earlier ones did. This is correct for a very late model Morris Minor. We can see the air cleaner here. Morris Minor went through a series of air cleaners. Honestly, for some of the early cars, the air cleaner looks bigger than the engine itself. And this would be consistent then with a very late model Morris Minor. So pretty much everything we see here in this car is consistent with this being a car that was produced with an engine built probably around late 1969, the final car built sometime around 1970, and then registered, licensed in the UK in 1971. And that all seems to go together. Everything seems to match up very nicely, and we kind of know where we are. Now, what about some originality hints? One, the valve cover, bits of paint here. We can see that sort of Morris green, olive green paint. We see that that was also applied to the intake manifold, so that's something we're going to want to do. There's some flecking of silver paint here. I'm not sure that's original or not. We'll have to keep working on that on the exhaust manifold. If we dig down a little bit further, one of the questions is, how did they finish the fans on these? Were they yellow like the earlier Minors? Some of the very earliest ones had red fan blades and red hubs. Was the hub yellow? You know, were the fans yellow? Well, in cleaning up the fan, and this is the hub, what we discovered then is underneath some very, hastily applied silver paint, we're finding the yellow paint. And there's a little bit of red on there too, which is on top of the yellow, which leads me to believe at some point someone put it into red, then they stripped it down to the yellow, then they put it in silver, but the yellow's down there. So, and there's bits of flecks of yellow on the fan blades as well. So we're going to go with yellow on that. That's the way it went. Now, a lot of times you find that the alternator, or the not alternators in this particular case, but the dynamo or the generator are painted the same color as the engine. And when we pulled the generator, we found lots of evidence that not only was the round body of the generator, but the two ends were also painted in the same color of green as this, which was pretty typical in these cars. And so it gives us a hint as to how to refinish the generator. And in another episode, I'm going to talk about putting new fresh brushes in the generator and getting the generator back up and functioning. But so those are kind of hints that we get in terms of the finish of the car that can help us. The other thing is, for instance, these stands which hold the engine mounts, they were black, and we can still see some of the gloss black there. So they were put in after the body had been painted blue and when the engine was mounted, and so they were painted black in the factory, and we will refinish it like that. So that's a little bit of archaeology and investigation into the Morris Minor, a few things that help us basically firm up its provenance and will help us then in having the correct colors in the restoration of this vehicle.